Let me welcome Professor Damayanti Banerjee. So a brief introduction about her. So Professor Damayanti Banerjee is a faculty research associate in the Department of Sociology at Colorado State University, working on climate change, energy policy and governance, and environmental justice. She received her PhD from the Department of Sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, MPhil and MA from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and BA from Calcutta University. She taught previously at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and Western Kentucky University, and received multiple honors, including the Ford Foundation Dissertation Award. So her ongoing research project, funded by the Fulbright Nehru Senior Scholar Award, examines climate change adaptation and resilience efforts in the Sundarbans. So more about it, actually we were privileged to host her. So as a part of her Fulbright Nehru Scholarship, she chose IIM Calcutta as the host institute, and a warm welcome from our side. And over to you, Professor Damayanti.
Thank you. I think I have it. Okay. So good afternoon. Thank you for hosting me. I've been meeting people for the past 2 weeks, and it's been an honor to be here and talk to all of you. So my presentation, the title is Environmental Policymaking, Impact of Climate Change Migration on Communities in the Sundarbans. This is funded by the Fulbright Nehru, I think, Academic and Professional Excellence Award, which is for scholars. And it's for 6 months, so I'll be in India I came here in March and I'll be here until September. And I plan to start my visits to Sundarban next week, in the next 10 days or so. So go stay there, interview people. So just to give you a brief background about my work, I'm a sociologist, so you'll hear a lot about sociology from me, which I'm sure many of you are not, so, but hopefully we'll have more conversation about that. To give you just a sort of an overview of what I do in terms of my research. So my research is mainly organized into 3 sort of broad categories. I broadly work on environmental inequality, which is basically exploring the structures, forms, and processes in which environmental inequalities manifest themselves. Just to give you an example about what that means. In the 1970s in the United States, a working class community was built on top of a landfill in Buffalo, New York, which is in upstate area in the state of New York. And the community members did not know that they were sitting on top of a landfill until people started getting sick. So most of the households somebody had cancer in most of the households, and that got the attention of some of the community residents who just, they had no training in anything. They just kind of took the soil from their backyard to the University of Buffalo and got it tested and found out that this area has been used as a landfill for close to 100 years. And nobody told them that their houses were sitting on top of it. So that, in the 1970s, that led to the Love Canal movement, which led to a lot of change they were resettled, they were compensated for the loss of health issues that they have been having. And that led to a lot of discussion about who are the people who end up at the wrong end of environmental problems, right? And that's something that is also tied to my work in the Sundarbans, and we'll talk about that a bit later. So what they talked about is that since this is a working class community, which is a poorer community, that they did not have any way of knowing that they were sitting on top of a landfill, and they had no connection to make sure that they were not victims of that. So environmental inequality looks at these kinds of issues of how environmental resources are distributed, who gets the environmental goods, who gets the environmental problems. And most often in the United States, and of course in other parts of the world as well, those happen in terms of race, class, or gender. Women tend to be more affected because of it. So these environmental inequality studies that. Other than that, I also look at environmental and climate justice movement, which my Sundarbans work will be about. That is a little bit different than environmental inequality, because instead of looking at structures, forms, and processes of inequality, environmental justice or climate justice looks at how the people who are affected by it respond to these kinds of things. How do they fight back? What kind of resources do they have to seek justice or to seek resettlement or compensation or something? So I've done work in parts of the United States, in southern United States, in a community called Land Between the Rivers, this was for my dissertation, my PhD work, funded by the Ford Foundation, and as part of that, I had to live with that community for 12 months. This is a very, very rural, sort of very conservative politically, very red, as in like very Republican kind of state. And living there, I mean, as a woman of color, as someone who's a complete outsider to the country, it was an experience, but it was an interesting experience, and the people were nice. But what they were doing is this community has been living in that part of the country for generations, for like almost 300 years. And since the 1960s, because of dam construction and because of a natural preserve that was built there, they were moved out of it. They were pretty much forced out of it. In pretty bad ways. They would be called for negotiation over their households, and then just their houses would be demolished like that. So there's a lot of ill feeling there against how the state treated them. So I was looking at how this community was, they can't get the land back. It's now federal land. It's been taken from them. But what they can do is have some say in the decisions about the land. So I was looking at how they were trying to negotiate that. So that's environmental movement, justice movement. Here, the climate change, when we study climate change in Sundarbans, I'll be also looking at the challenges that the communities there are facing and how do they try to adapt to that, how do they try to build communities that might be more resilient to these kinds of pressures. And then as I was doing this research, one of the questions that I constantly hear, and since I do a lot of qualitative research, I get to talk to a lot of people. And one of the things that people seem to talk about is that, look what this government did to me. And that's not just about India, it's about all parts of the world, that see what they did to us. And that led me to think about this role of the state. What is it that the state does, which is what my third research focus is on: environmental governance, policy making. How is it that the state makes decisions about different things? How do the state use, or state agencies use scientific knowledge to make environmental policy decisions, and how are those decisions made? So that's kind of my broader focus, and that is linked to the topic I will talk about today first, which is, I have two topics to talk about, and I think Dr. Sarkar said that this would be a better way of doing this. So the first topic, the first project is completed. It's been completed now. This is about hydraulic fracturing in the United States, and I will be looking at, my study looked at the response of the two states, New York and Pennsylvania, which is where there is a lot of huge deposits of natural gas, and many of you are technical people, you probably know a lot more about hydraulic fracturing than I do. But these two states have huge deposits, and there has been a lot of effort to monetize that. And the idea is that if you can do that, then energy independence would be a good way, would be the path forward. So I looked at these two states, and especially how they framed the issue of hydraulic fracturing. The path they took was very different. New York has banned fracking entirely. Pennsylvania, it's ongoing, and they have been fracking in very large numbers. So the two states went in two different directions, and my question was to understand, how did this policy making happen? Why is it that the two states that are neighboring states that share a lot of cultural, political, sort of economic situations, socioeconomic conditions that are similar, why did they go in these two different directions? So that was my research question that I was examining there. And this is the original research question I was asking, which is the blue question, the specific question: why government decisions and actions on fracking differed markedly in New York and Pennsylvania. That was my specific question, and the broader sort of question at a higher level of abstraction is it possible to think of a theoretical framework, or to build toward a theoretical framework that would explain the state differences on largely similar questions? Why is it that the two states with such similar trajectory took two different pathways? And just to make one thing clear here, I mean, when we talk about state, people could say, well, is it the United States? Are you talking about the country? What is this level of analysis? And in this case, it is the state of New York and the state of Pennsylvania. Of course, a lot of fracking happens at the local and municipal level as well, but I did not look at that. Mine was just to look at the state agencies and how they function and how they made these decisions there. So that was my broader question. And then the next question is why, and I was thinking about this, that since this is an entirely United States focused research, so why should it be an issue in India? And I was looking looking at issues about hydraulic fracturing in India, and it is increasingly an important issue, given that with its growing population, a growing economy, lots of energy needs, and we all know about that. There is that pressure to pursue energy independence, and we are seeing with this war in Ukraine that there is a lot of India has to buy energy from other countries, given that it does not have large oil reserves on its own. So then fracking might be a way out of that will help the country pursue energy independence. It is also seen as a cheaper alternative to conventional oil and natural gas extraction. In Pennsylvania, for example, I've heard officials, bureaucrats say if you have like $10,000 and drilling equipments, you'll get a permit anytime you want and just start drilling. It was as simple. You don't need a lot of technical know-how to do that. All you need is just that certain amount of money. Large-scale drilling is ongoing in India in 56 sites, and I think the Gujarat has pretty large deposits where there is a lot of drilling happening already, fracking happening. Parts of southern India, the Indo-Gangetic Plain. So there are parts of India where this is happening, and there are some concerns about the limited demand for environmental impact assessment statements, which has led to concerns about, which is also another problem that India has, which is lack of limited fresh water supply. So this needs a lot of water to do, because fracking is you're creating a chemical cocktail with chemicals and a lot of water, and then you're blasting the deepest of rocks, and it's done horizontally, unlike conventional fracking, which is vertical. So you're going deep into the layers of the sedimentary rocks, and then you're blasting it with the chemical cocktail, and that releases the natural gas. So that means you need a lot of water. So given that India also has water scarcity problems, so what does it do to groundwater, for example, quality? Agriculture farmers would have a lot of concerns about that. Water level depletion is an issue. Freshwater scarcity could also become an issue. So all of these make the issue one of relevance in the context of India as well. So getting back to the US part, this is New York and Pennsylvania. Now just to give you a sense of how the New York state looks, New York City is in downstate New York. So that's where that is close to the ocean, that is on the east side of Albany, and that is entirely different in many different ways from upstate New York, which is where most of these deposits are. The Marcellus Shale deposit, Utica Shale, which is under the Marcellus Shale. So as you see, the deposits of natural gas is just huge, and that's been a thing they've been pursuing for the past 5 years, is that if they could actually frack as much as they want to, there are regulations, but they're trying to get rid of them. If they can frack as much as they want to, they might be able to get a lot of it. And energy independence could be the future, not depend on the Middle East, for example, for energy supply. So there's been a lot of emphasis on that. And even going beyond New York and Pennsylvania and states like West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, there is a lot of Utica Shale deposits as well, which is the layer underneath the Marcellus. So if you can go even deeper, that might be, release an enormous ton of resources there. So there is a lot of demand for that. So as I was looking at this information, I thought, well, let's look at what people have said. So what has other people done on this? And what I could find was mainly, some policy papers, some reports, some practitioner outlets. I did not find a lot of scholarly sort of academic work per se on this issue. And what I found there was really organized. I mean, I could organize them into really two groups, the literature that is available. And the question they were asking is, why did New York and Pennsylvania diverge in their pursuit of hydraulic fracturing? And you can make the literature fall into two groups. One group of scholars argued that it's mainly because they just had different regulatory regimes. They just function differently. Their environmental laws are different. New York has much more, they have laws that go back to the 1970s and are more well-structured, more well-defined. Pennsylvania does not. It's much more diffused. So they just have different regulatory regimes which led to a different set of outcomes. Other group of scholars argue it's just a matter of the type of citizenry you have. So, New York has more environmental activism compared to Pennsylvania, so that might explain that. But if you actually look at some of the claims that they're making here, the first is, if you look at, so for example, difference in population or citizenry views and then regulatory regimes. If you look at citizen-based differences, it's actually not really true. So for example, if you look at New York and Pennsylvania, upstate New York and Pennsylvania, where much of these resources are, the communities there has been on an economic depression for like 70 plus years. These areas like Erie, Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Elmira, Rochester, and Buffalo, these used to be steel-making hubs of the world, manufacturing hubs of the world. That's just pretty much gone. And that has been leaving for like the last 50 years. So this is almost like an economic depression there for a very, very long time. So it's not that there is no demand for it. There are no jobs there. GE, for example, used to hire in the 1950s about 350,000 people in that area. Now they hire 4,000. Most of the steel makers are just gone. So there is a lot of demand for jobs. So the communities are similar. Socioeconomic realities there are similar. There's also similarity in community makeup. This is largely in New York and Pennsylvania. Both are pretty rural. Agricultural small farmers who are sitting on top of very large oil reserves. So you don't have jobs, you don't have any scope of employment. You have a small farm and you're sitting on top of reserves which people want, and they're going to pay you any amount of money you want. So there is a lot of demand for it. And then as far as environmental activism is concerned, some people argued that New York is more environmentally, given that it has a democratic left, sort of center-left government, it's more environmentally active than Pennsylvania, which is also not true. If you look at the exact number of environmental groups working in New York and Pennsylvania, there is not much difference. These are groups especially working on fracking. Citizen perception, there isn't much difference. So it's not that citizens in Pennsylvania are somehow less engaged. So these two things do not really explain why is it that New York and Pennsylvania took the different pathways. If you look at the second point they made was that about regulatory regimes, but then they said New York and Pennsylvania has different regulatory systems, hence the outcome. But that just explains the outcome. It doesn't say why did the state make those decisions differently in the two states. So I thought it might be useful for my research to try and open the black box a little bit and examine the actual processes through which states make their decisions. So I decided to look at the agency and the processes of the state in making decisions about the fracking. So looking at, for example, the capacity and the authority of the state, what did the state do? How did the state actually make those decisions? To do that, I spoke with legislative elected officials in Pennsylvania and New York. Much of this work is, of course, since it's a policy study, so I had to do a lot of archival work on actual bills that were passed and bills that were introduced. So that was the major part of it. But I also did interviews, because if you do archival secondary data research, there are always gaps in your understanding about what people actually felt or said. So I decided also to do interviews with for example, elected representatives in Pennsylvania, the upper house and the lower house, their staff members, the legal folks that wrote the bills, the lawyers with the agency officials in both states. So there were a lot of about 25 to 30 interviews. Yes.
New York has been more blue than red, right?
Yes.
More red than blue.
Yes, that's right. New York has actually, it's like almost like California in that it has,
Right.
yes,
I mean,
yes, politically. Yes, that's right. Yeah. So I was looking at, to understand the agency of the state, how does it work? I did the interviews and looked at the bills. And then I also looked at some of the processes by which the state makes, or the tools that the state uses to make to make these kinds of policies. The audio, it's a short 3-minute audio that talks about the conflict over the regulations that were introduced by President Obama's office after 4 years of study. And there was protest from the corporations, the oil and gas, natural gas lobby, who said this is just too much involvement. The environmental group said this is just too little involvement. So it was just a huge amount of fight that broke out. Even though they studied for 4 years, they did leave a lot of loopholes. So for example, even when regulations were introduced, one of the loopholes that was left was that if corporations, if oil and gas companies wanted, they would not have to disclose what chemicals they use while they're fracking if they say it's a trade secret. So that was a huge loophole that a lot of people were very unhappy about, because that just pretty much gets them off the hook in terms of what chemicals they're using to blast the rocks. So the role of the state remains important, even though we may argue that the corporations have a lot more power to make decisions about these. The state remains important, so it's important to study it. Also, but then the next question is, how does the state study it? What are some of the tools that the state uses to make those decisions? And here, I decided to, and as I said, I talked to legislatures, executive offices, but as I was thinking about, okay, I'm talking to all of these people, I'm looking at all the data, but then how do I understand how do I organize or theorize about the tools that the state uses to make decisions about fracking? And I looked at some of the some of the sociological theories that some of you, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but one of the theories that I looked at was from Michel Foucault, who was a philosopher, French philosopher, who talked about the role of the state, the power of the state in a very non-Marxian kind of way. But what he does is he talks about how the state does two things to control knowledge, the role of the state, and he's talking about in a different context. He's talking about it in terms of identity and sexual identity and all that. We are talking about environmental knowledge. What I am talking about here, based on Foucault's idea, is that the role of the state, how the state manages these discussions about fracking is through two ways. One, the state's role is to normalize. So what does normalization mean? This is from Foucault, but what he means here is that the state sets the context within which decisions happen. So for example, just to give some examples about how does the state normalize certain forms of knowledge. So for example, when the state is talking about fracking, it might argue that it is economically beneficial, but it might not argue that it has environmental impacts like groundwater contamination. So what the state highlights or legitimizes is more important than what it's not. So the role of the state in that context becomes important. So one example, for example, case of genetically manufactured seeds, right? That is a very big issue in developing countries around the world, where the states have always highlighted that, well, genetically manufactured seeds are going to lead to poverty reduction, right? What it does not talk about when it says poverty reduction is that it might have impact on bacterial toxins in genetically manufactured seeds, might have an impact on the human body. There are discussions about transparency of the actual field trials that happen, how it happens, who does it, who benefits from it. We know very little about it. Crop immunity to new forms of pests, we have very little idea about it. Loss of biological diversity, of, like, for example, brinjals, there's been discussions about loss of biological diversity there. So there is a lot of issue that is not highlighted. So the state's role in this is to set the context within which you make decisions. Another one, clean coal technology. It is very big in the United States. And the focus is on what the state highlights is that it will lead to clean emissions, right? We will be able to take care of emissions problems, greenhouse gas emissions, we will be able to reduce it, which is true. But then the focus of clean coal is that the coal is clean when it comes to emissions. The coal is not clean in the extraction process, and there is almost no discussion about the extraction process, which is in the United States, there are mining communities in West Virginia which have been completely destroyed because of what is sometimes called mountaintop mining. They just remove the top of a mountain and just go in and get the coal out, and all of the things that come out of it, just the communities live in the valleys in between mountains. So as you can imagine how that affects the communities that are in the valleys. So mountaintop mining removal is one issue that's not mentioned. Release of unregulated byproducts of clean coal like sulfur and its impact on human health, not mentioned. Coal ash deposits, is a very big problem in India. There's been bursts of coal ash. They have these dams that they keep this coal ash that then has been some accidents that has led to the deposits, the dams bursting and things getting into water. So they contain arsenic, selenium, and other stuff that's also not mentioned. So normalization refers to that, what is highlighted and what is not. And that's where the state plays a very important role. The second way in which the state acts is what is called Scientization, which is use of scientific knowledge. How do you set the context? The state can't just say, oh, greenhouse gas emissions are reducing, it is good. You have to actually show some data to prove it, right? So the state has to provide all the necessary data, and it has the tools to do that, right? So for example, when the Obama administration created that loophole saying that, chemicals, you don't have to disclose the type of chemicals for fracking, and just by saying it's a trade secret, they provided a lot of data saying that it has been allowed before, so it is perfectly acceptable, even though there were questions about how does then people know what chemical is being used and what its health effect is on health, on water and other resources. So Scientization refers to the use of scientific documents, statistics, evidence to help the state set the context. So now this is sort of the background theoretical issues that I talked about in my paper, in my research, and then looking at the hydraulic fracking thing. So now that we know the state does normalization and scientization, and that's how in New York and Pennsylvania the states made their decisions by highlighting certain forms of knowledge. In New York, in Pennsylvania, they highlighted other forms of knowledge, and that's how the decisions were made. Let's look at a little bit about hydraulic fracturing or fracking, which I have some secondary slides, but I don't want to take up too much time. If there are questions, we can come back to that. But this is a technology used to extract natural gas from shale rock formation. So what they do is conventional digging is extraction is it goes vertically down and doesn't go to that. It doesn't go to that level. So it's just a little bit. And then this one, hydraulic fracturing, it's horizontal digging. So it goes down and then goes like this. And they inject those chemical fluid, and that blasts the rocks open, and then that's how you get it out. And it goes much deeper under the ground. So that's been a concern there. The scope and intensity has really increased over the last few years, and there are concerns. So for example, there are, I've heard anecdotes in my interviews of people turning on their taps in the kitchen and the water just explodes. They live close to those wells, so there are pretty serious, and there are evidences of that, of just tap water exploding for no reason. So there's concerns about runoff, concern about water pollution, air pollution, impact on farmland, agriculture, noise, and earthquakes. There has been a lot of earthquakes in areas that are close, probably because they are digging into this deep underground sedimentary rocks that are way underground and maybe disturbing the rock formation there. But there has been concern, there's been a frequency of earthquakes has increased in parts of the country where fracking happens. Again, I'm just going to, you can't, if you have eyesight like me, you can't read it. So this is just the basic history of fracking in the United States. People say it's new, it's not that new. It goes back to 1865 when the first well was created to fracture. But if you go back to 1999 is when hydraulic fracturing as we know it was introduced for the first time in Texas. And then since 2004, EPA, the Environment Protection Agency, which is sort of the Department of Environment in the federal government, has been studying it, and there has been regulations back and forth. So the Democratic administration comes in, they create a set of regulations. The Republican administration comes in, they just roll it back. So it's just been going back and forth like that. So with the Biden administration, there has been some, again, creating more regulations, even though they have been giving out licenses a lot. But a Republican administration will come in, and under Trump administration, all of the regulations were rolled up. So that's how it just goes on and on there. So this is sort of the basic history of it. If you look at the history of fracking in New York has been they have more well-structured laws than Pennsylvania when it comes to environmental issues. So they have been a lot more on top of it than Pennsylvania is. So in 1975, they created the Department of Environmental Conservation, but between 2005 and 2008, there was pressure from oil and gas lobbies who decided, and the government decided to give them permits to do it, which led to a change of the governor, another Democrat, but then with a different purpose, I guess. But then that led to a moratorium. When the new governor came in, there was led to a moratorium on it. They said, we want to study it. And then by 2015, New York just plain decided to ban it altogether because there was just too many concerns there. And then if you go to New York, Pennsylvania is a bit more diffused in terms of dealing with it. The people I talked to said that it's very easy to get a drilling permit for anybody. You don't need a lot of technical know-how. So for example, in 2012, they gave out, per month, they gave out 10,312 drilling permits, and only 36 were denied. So you must be like really bad at writing your permit request to get it denied because everybody got it. And one of the key issues in Pennsylvania is that people would dig and they would pick up their equipment and then leave, and then you have these wells that are sitting there and nobody has closed it, or it's just like an open well sitting right there in front of people's homes, for example, or farms. So that is one of the key issues that they face in Pennsylvania because of the indiscriminate amount of permits that was given. So this is Pennsylvania, and then this is to talk a little bit about how I did my research. So keep in mind that my work is mostly archival here because of the policy aspect of it. So I did the theoretical part, followed by the document collection that I spent a lot of time on. I collected all sorts of documents and data from state legislative archives, from regulatory briefs, legal statutes, bills that were proposed, bills that were tabled, bills that were passed, did not pass, discussion of bills, all of it for 20 years in each state. I did the interviews with the speakers of the Senate and the House, the upper and the lower house in each state, the chairman of the environment committees there, their staff members, the lawyers who are associated with it, as many people as I could find who were willing to talk to me from both political parties to get a sense of how they viewed it. I also talked to the Department of Environmental Protection folks, the bureaucrats there in New York and Pennsylvania as well, to see how they were doing the coding, and also folks at Cornell University and Penn State, where they have these agricultural extension people, environmental agricultural extension people who work with, who sort of like the liaison between academia and the field. So I spoke with them to get a sense of how they were seeing some of these. So using that, I'm using a qualitative software, NVivo, to do my analysis. So just using some of so it's a content analysis. So you take like a quote from a bill, and then you introduce it, and then the NVivo thing just kind of codes it and puts it in different groups. So content analysis of documents, it's ongoing. We just finished the interviews in November, and then I started a little bit, and then this thing happened. I got this Fulbright in 2020, so they have been postponing it because of COVID, and then suddenly they said, okay, you have to go now. So I kind of stopped doing what I was doing, and that's been sitting there. So I did a little bit of interviews and a little bit of analysis. Hopefully I'll have more to say once I have more analysis done. These are some of the representative list of archives that I looked at in New York and Pennsylvania. There are two coders who are working on coding the documents. I have about 7,000 documents, so it's very painstaking work. It's taking a lot more time to just sort of insert the information. And the interviews are also there, which I'll add later, but the files are a lot. So just to give you a sense of what I have found so far, it's very preliminary, so bear with me. But in NVivo, the codes are called nodes, right? So this is how I have tried to organize them. You have pro-fracking views, and so when you have quotes from, say, bills or interviews, you just first organize them into, that's how I am doing it at least. You put them in pro-fracking group or anti-fracking group, like people who support it, people who oppose it. And after that, I thought that we have to break it down a little bit because there's lots of things in it. So we have pro-Scientization views, pro-normalization views, and then you have anti-Scientization, anti-normalization views. But then even that does not take care of everything, because what does it mean when you say people who are in favor of Scientization arguments for fracking? So I looked at what kind of arguments are these. Some people are making economic arguments saying this is the economic reason why fracking is good for Pennsylvania, or this is an environmental reason why fracking is good for Pennsylvania. So I tried to break them up into economic arguments and environmental arguments that are in favor of fracking, favor of scientization in fracking, and favor of normalization, and then did the same with anti-fracking. And then of course there are still quotations which doesn't really fall in either category, so right now for the time being, they are sort of motive ambiguous, and we'll figure it out as we go along and see what those can be, if that can be parsed a little bit more to get a sense of what it means. So just to give you some examples of the quotes that I have found so far, this is a quote, for example, of normalization using an economic argument, where this person was saying, or probably this is from a person, that that fracking was good because it actually led to employment, not just in the fracking wells, but that when you have a fracking well, you have these ancillary industries that develop, right? So you have hotels, people have to live somewhere, right? You have the service industry, you have restaurants, you have real estate marketing. So there's a lot of development around the fracking happening, which is a really good economic argument for fracking. An environmental argument that was also made to support fracking is that says that there are it lowers the cost of electricity, for example, that we could produce more natural gas. So this is a good way to become energy independent. And then of course some of the scientization data that was presented also in some of the bills and stuff talking about which are pro-fracking views. And then you have some anti-fracking views as well. This I thought was interesting that I was hoping that when I look at the data, I will find, given that New York is more sort of center-left democratic government for decades, I was thinking that they would say there's anti-fracking sentiment there, and the argument used is environmental. They did not use that. Most of the things I found was that there was an economic argument saying this is the reason why fracking is bad, and it's an economic argument that I did not expect. So for example, they were saying that this area has a long tradition of tourism industry. That will be really in the long term affected by these open wells. If you live there, nobody's going to come and visit us, and these people will take their gas and their money and go away, and then we'll be stuck with these open wells and no tourists. So that is why we don't support fracking. So that I thought was interesting. I was hoping that they would talk about environment, but they did not. So there were some interesting things we have found in the very sort of preliminary findings in the data, which I'm hoping will tell us a bit more as we do more data analysis. But in New York, for example, we see a prevalence of economic scientization arguments against fracking in the New York data. They were using a lot of economic arguments to say fracking is bad, and that for our state. Whereas in Pennsylvania, there were a lot of environmental arguments saying that, see what we could do if we have better technology. For example, there is a lot of emphasis now on cryo-fracking, which is apparently something that you can do without using fresh water or any water resources, which might just completely revolutionize the whole thing. So they are saying if we can have technological advances, we will not have to worry about the environment at all. And actually fresh water will be protected and saved. So in Pennsylvania, there is a lot of argument being used using sort of environmental arguments. So the prevalence of arguments seem to be a little bit different than what I was expecting. That also might change over time if you look at the data a bit more. So if there is a change in government, change in the regulatory bodies, long term, they might have a different kind of argument to make there. And then some of the other things, as I just said, some people talked about in Pennsylvania that, it's not so much that fracking is good or bad. Why can't we really focus on that humans have the potential for creativity, for developing technologies that might help us solve some of these issues, instead of saying, oh, let's just not do it because fracking might have these impacts. So there are some of those discussions as well that is ongoing. So I'm just hoping to find some thematic associations there, some co-occurrence of ideas. If there are clusters of themes that will emerge as we do the more of the content analysis, I think more of the stuff will be clearer in terms of what we find there, and I'm hoping that might give us a better idea about where we are going. So this is the first project, and should I stop or just, this is like 5 more slides, so I can just kind of continue. This is the current project that I will be working on, which is on climate justice. A little bit different from what I was doing before, so it's been a bit of a shift for me. But here, this is Sundarbans, as you can see. And here, what the interesting thing is, most of the people, when they talk about Sundarbans, they talk about, okay, climate change is affecting the delta. And the delta is this one little whole thing, which is it's not. The effect is absolutely very uneven in the place. So if you go to, for example, Sagar Island, Namkhana, Pathor Pratima, these areas which are much more sort of exposed to the elements are very severely affected than, say, if you go to the central, this is the central part of, this is the south, this is the central, and that is sort of the north. The central part, Canning, Bashanti, Goshaba, those areas, which is where a lot of the media focus is, which is where the effect is there is effect, but it's not as devastating as it is in the south, which is this part, this island. So here, Gorumar, I think it's called, I forgot the name of the island. There is an island that is just going down. It's going to be underwater pretty soon. And Ghoramara Island, sorry. Ghoramara Island, which is going to be, there's about 2,000 people living there. It's going to be underwater very soon. Everybody knows it. And most people are slowly moving away from there. And that has been happening in Sundarbans for some time. It's largely because if you look across that island, here is Holdia. And when during the previous administration, I think, when Holdia Petrochemicals, they were doing development, they dropped a lot of concrete in the ocean, and that kind of led to the water flooding the Ghoramara Island. So that is one of the reasons why it's going underwater now. So those people will have to move to Shagor Island or somewhere else. They'll be resettled. But that area is where my research is going to be mostly. I will talk to people in other parts, but most of the research, my research is going to be in this area, which is also pretty remote and pretty hard to get to. So I have some folks who are helping me, who are familiar to that area and who are going to help me talk to people there. So I'm hoping that might be useful. Sundarbans, the mangrove forest have always demonstrated sort of its physiological adaptation capacity to tidal waterways. That's not a very, very hospitable area to live in. So it's a very hard kind of life for a long time before even climate change became an issue. But there is demonstrable tolerance of the mangrove forest to high salinity, for example. But nothing has really prepared it for rising sea levels, which is very fast and happening very fast, and the effects are very, very harsh. Increased salinity, decrease in freshwater flows, and of course the impact is uneven for these people. What are some of the key issues that from my very preliminary work that I've found is that, of course, climate change is not just climate change, right? It has an effect on economic life, it has an effect on people's livelihoods and everything. So one of the key issues that emerge that is constantly talked about is the forced migration. And that kind of really happened after it happened after 2009, after the cyclone Aila. It just completely devastated Sundarbans. And World Bank, I think, did a study about 5 years back where they said only 6% of the communities there have actually been able to overcome the impact of it, even though it was in 2009, it's been many years since then. And of course, the two other cyclones really didn't help also. And of course, there is, and I was reading this paper that said that the cyclone Aila really transformed a mainly self-sufficient agricultural community into a market-based one without the tools that they need to adapt to that. So it just really destroyed them in very harmful ways. COVID, of course, has added to that because a lot of people just kind of had no place to go, and many people came back to the islands because they lost their jobs in other parts of the country. I was reading about these folk dancers and folk singers in the area, like they do putul nach and other things, and they, of course, COVID means they can't do any of that. So most of those groups have now kind of broken up, they have dispersed all over the country, and these are oral history traditions that are, if it's not pursued, they're just going to lose it. So there is that concern as well about cultural loss. There are concerns about increased pace of land loss, especially in the far-reaching islands where it's hard to get to. There are concerns about access rights to forests. Now, this is something that is a little sensitive in many ways, in that who has access rights to the forest is a very difficult question to answer. So what the state government does is that gives people permits to go into the forest to collect honey or collect crab. And that process itself is, of course, mired in politics, as everything is. So the people who are dependent on the forest, many of them just go in there without a permit. And if there is a tiger attack, for example, they're not compensated because they were not supposed to be there. But increasingly, it's become harder to do these jobs in the buffer region. They have to go into the actual inner forest, which is a dangerous part of the Sundarbans. So there has been loss of life, loss of compensation because of how the permits are distributed. And many of these people have been sort of agitating a little bit to make the process much more seamless and much more transparent so that there is a clear idea about access rights, access to forest. And then there is this final angle that I've been talking to people and they mentioned, especially after ILA, human trafficking really increased there, given that there were a lot of vulnerable women, vulnerable young girls, and there was a lot of, especially after ILA, until 2012, the numbers were very high of women being trafficked into Bangladesh, or women in the Bangladesh part of Sundarbans being trafficked into India and just getting lost in the system. And given that there is very low conviction rate in India, about 1.9% of human traffickers are ever convicted. So that leads to a lot of challenge. And there's been discussion that maybe getting people to pay attention to the human trafficking aspect might be useful if we tie it to climate change. That even though climate change may not seem like the reason why it's happening, it is possible to see the connection there, that when we have these kinds of sudden devastation, the human trafficking rates might increase. So that is those are some of the concerns that have been talked about constantly. And I'm just looking at some of the literature, and again, right now, since I've not done any interviews, I haven't been there in any big way yet. But I'm just looking at the literature. I was looking at Ulrich Beck, who is a German sociologist. He wrote many books. One of the books was Risk Society, where he talks about how increasingly with globalization, we are living in a world where our problems are, problems are global. Its effects, of course, are not global. People who have money and resources are not affected as much as people who don't. But the problems are global, like climate change. So we have to think of move away from the class-based, whatever analysis, Marxian analysis of society towards a more risk-based society. And how do we deal with some of the challenges of a risk-based society is a key question that he talks about in his work. And then I also looked at resilience. I'm looking at some of the climate change adaptation and mitigation literature that talks about what factors might motivate people to adapt to climate change. So folks who look at sort of the micro behavioral actions of people, they talk about people's climate change risk is informed by their social interactions, by their cultural worldview. Others talk about the value of communication in getting people to take reasoned action. There are macroeconomic studies as well that I thought were very, very interesting, where they talk about international coordination, of course, is important, which country is doing what, and actually tracking what the countries are doing to help with adaptation. But then domestic policy action like carbon pricing, getting corporations to pay for the externalization of cost, so that that either people or our future generations are not left holding the bag, that we are the ones who have to pay for it. So carbon pricing, spending, and investment, very specific strategic investments, might be useful to actually get people to adapt to it. But how to do that it's a still open debate, and I'm hoping my study will help with some of that. And then there is climate resilience theories. There are many as well that look at how do people build resilient communities that of course we are all, in Sundarbans, we are always going to have these kinds of problems, and climate change is not going away. So if people are to live in the island, what kind of jobs can we imagine? How do we reinvent the area or reimagine the jobs that might be useful, that will allow them to live in their land, but in a way that is not entirely dependent on the forest, or in a way that is much more possible for them. So there is literature on disaster resilience, on risk assessment and resilience building. There are some smart innovation studies that are done in Africa that might be useful. So I'm looking at some of the literature to think what might be useful. And these are some of the broader questions. And again, the questions will be much more specific when I talk to the communities to understand what challenges they face, how they hope to address those. And again, most of my work is going to be in the southern tip, which is the most vulnerable, to get a sense of how people are dealing with that. And it's ethnographic study, so I'll be in the field interviewing communities. Participant observation just means if they have like a community meeting or something, local meeting, if they give permission, I can just sit in and listen to them, and with permission, if I can do that. And then of course some archival data, maps, just do the historical tracing of how the climate change process has worked over the years. So I think I'm done here. So I'm going to stop. If you have questions, I'll be happy to answer, or if you have advice or suggestions and things about Sundarbans that you think might be beneficial for me to look into, I would be very, very happy about that.
Yeah, so I think you have done much more like research on this than I probably know, but in the field, but there is something which is specific to India and the people in Sundarban could be like between adaptation and resilience. I think adaptation is probably a better strategy. I know none of us are doing enough to actually mitigate the risk, right? So we're sitting in an AC room. So we know that.
Yes.
So and we know that it is going to impact them first, and then probably us.
Exactly.
So in that probably us, so we
Right.
sort of keep ourselves safe. So I think that adaptation as a strategy would work for most of the people in India. I read a case on Dhan Foundation. Okay, so they are asking people to cultivate the small millets. Because that is water, like,
Okay.
so,
Okay.
it doesn't require a lot of water to
Okay.
get, so then they have the food security. So some such things, which is like, so of course, like, I also feel that awareness should be raised to the extent
Right.
it is possible. Inside this campus, also people don't care about uses of plastics. Right? And then how can you think about the poor, the deprived, the marginalized, taking care of plastic use? So it's a very sad and sorry state, but I don't know the approaches, the response that can be worked out. That is also a sad state that we don't know how to deal with it.
I think you make a good point, because there is there are some arguments that people say, well, mitigation, probably at some point we just have to give up on mitigation. We may not have enough, enough time left to mitigate it anymore. So the next question is, how do you adapt? And that's where it becomes, the one example that you give was, I think, water resistant, or things that need less water, if we can grow that. And I think there are some examples of like people, just moving away from depending on the forest to these they've formed these dairy co-ops in Bashanti, I think, where the women are in charge. They do this organic dairy farming business, and they sell to like states like Assam and Tripura and other places, and they've been making a good living doing that. But that's again very small example. So that looking for those might be the best opportunity and best option, given where we are in terms of those communities, because they are at the front line of it. So they're immediately going to be affected by any change. Yeah, so that's true. Mitigation may not work anymore.
I'd like to go back to your Pennsylvania and New York story, and the way you sort of set it up. Now, one of the things you said was that the two areas are very different, right? Yet they have similar histories of deindustrialization, right? And the other thing that you also said is that underlying a lot of their response to environmental issues are arguments that relate to economics,
Yeah.
right? Which to me is actually quite straightforward, which is that one way of making sense of that is to ask the question, what are the trajectories the two states have used in coping with deindustrialization, right? And one thing that will emerge almost immediately is that upstate New York, not downstate New York, upstate New York in the last 20, 30, 40 years has switched to using tourism as a way of generating economic activity.
That's right.
Right? Whereas Pennsylvania hasn't. Now, I do not know why Pennsylvania hasn't. I just know that New York has. Right? Now, the moment I fit that in, then if you use certain other kinds of economic opportunities, they're no longer cost-free economic opportunities.
That's right. Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So you'll get the differences that you have gone.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's point number one. Point number two is that, when you say that the state uses control of knowledge as a way of scientization and therefore controlling the debate. Now, all states for all times have always done this.
That's right.
So that's not new. And all states at all times have always failed.
That's right.
Even that's not new.
That's true.
Right? So, tobacco companies have told you smoking is not good until somebody found out they fudged the data.
Of course.
All right? Climate change told you climate change is not a problem until somebody found out they fudged the data.
That's right.
Right? So if you problematize that, right? So how does the state generate that knowledge? And is that impervious? It isn't. Right? You will get a little more traction into how it changes over time.
Yes.
Right?
That's a good point.
And the last point I want to make, and this is relevant to India as well, is if you see New York State versus Pennsylvania, New York has much more legislative action.
Yes.
Pennsylvania does not. Right. Now, I again don't know why it's so, but why it's important is that once there is legislative action, it actually closes something. And reopening is a very costly thing.
That's right.
Right?
That's a good point.
Pennsylvania, and so that you can take the same thing and look at the United States today. So what Biden is faced with, the Congress is divided.
That's right.
So what does he do? He does what he can, which is not legislative, which is executive powers. Trump came and undid that. Now, if you had pushed through legislation, you couldn't have done it.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah, so yes.
Now, in India, the Forest Rights Act.
That's right.
Now,
I was going to
forget
mention that.
going to the provenance of the Forest Right. It's done. It's a done deal. And undoing it is very expensive. The Land Acquisition Act. None of the elites wanted the land acquisition. It went through nonetheless. Modi spent his first 2 years trying to undo the Land Acquisition Act. He could not. Right? So why you get legislative triumphs in some instances and not in others, again, problematizes that space.
Yes. That's true.
You know? So I think it sort of makes the research a little more open-ended. Currently, it's sort of closing all the time.
That's right.
You know? And then it'll afford, then how you read the codes also begins to change, right? To say that they have similar rights, or some rights may
Yes.
not be as much as use rights,
That's right. Yeah.
right? But it also means a certain kind of democratization of the political process.
Yes, exactly.
you know. So what I want to say is that I think you need to problematize this framework a little more. Yeah, and also the whole governmentality thing. I mean, that model has actually done a lot of stuff, which now looks nothing like what Foucault started. And Foucault himself, one was looking at private space. You're looking at public spaces.
That's right.
It's all. Anyways, thanks
no,
much.
That's absolutely. Foucault has been, used to talk about many different things that he was not keen on. But what he was keen on is to differentiate the way in which power works from what Marx was talking about. Marx's power was, okay, the state, the capitalists have the power. You have haves and have-nots. So there is a class-based analysis. Foucault's idea was that power is more diffused. It is not always those who own the means of production who wield the power, rather that the state has many different ways in which it can use knowledge to make something legitimate. So for example, Foucault was talking about sexuality, right? And he was talking about historically what became the acceptable form of behavior compared to others. And he was in a very different context, but he was talking about what was acceptable in Western society and what was not. And according to him, homosexuality became unacceptable because that is how the state framed it. So he was talking about power, use of power as being a much more diffused force than how Marx was. That was his main idea, yes.
But today you're back.
Yes, yeah.
Today you're back and recognizing the fact of homosexuality, right? Whether the state likes it or not.
But only through a lot of pressure from many different pressure groups. That does not mean the state's actions were not as painful. Yes.
As a locus for struggle.
That's right. Exactly. The state as the arbiter. I mean, the way I want to see it is that the state. It's not that the state, when it normalizes or scientizes it does something automatically negative. It is just it is an arbiter of knowledge. The state has that power to shape and influence knowledge, and it has had it for like many different things for many different reasons. So it is not that is a bad thing or good thing. It's just that is something the state has. And the way it and how people push back against it, when they push back against it, how different groups work around it is also changing all the time. But that is something that the state has. It exercises that power because that is what the state's supposed to do. Its role is to set the context within which corporations and oil gas lobbies and environmental groups can argue about what is what is too much action and what is not enough action on fracking. And all these kinds of contentious issues become the state's role become important there because it has to do it. But sometimes when it does it tries minimizing certain things and not talking so much about other things. And then it becomes the responsibility of other groups to make sure that knowledge is also, that knowledge is also, it's not like people are just sitting there, people have to do it. So that is also important. Pay attention to that as well. So yes. Those are excellent points. Good. I always enjoy, talking about all the points you made, especially about New York and Pennsylvania. Those are, the states are similar in many ways, even though they took a different pathway. I don't know if New York is going to again start fracking. That is also a possibility at some point. But Pennsylvania it's ongoing, and other states are getting in the business because they're seeing it as a way to generate a lot of money for their states.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I have two quick questions, one on each of the two pastures that you have covered. To begin with, shall we go to that slide where you have displayed the en vivo codes?
This one, right?
Yes, yes. So this is what my question looks like. You see, you started off by saying that you are looking at the structures, forms, and processes of the differences in the policies, isn't it, between these two states?
That was like my research overview point. That is what I do generally in research. For
Indeed.
this project, I was looking at how the state acts, what is the agency of the state, what is the capacity of the state, what is the policy that the state uses, what is its rationale for action, and what are some of the tools that the state uses to act in certain
and so
ways.
when
Yes.
you say how the state acts, you are therefore looking at the process of decision making.
Yes, yes.
Right? So I really liked when you subsequently talked of the temporal distribution.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm just curious to know, which is typical to any process study, because I'm not able to locate evidences here. How exactly are you undertaking the temporal bracketing that is necessary for process studies?
Okay, yeah. So I think there was one of the slides where not this one, talked about the temporal distribution part. So what I looked at was, the first was to look at the prevalence, like what is the prevalent argument in certain cases, and then I also looked at by the temporal distribution, which is where I was looking at, let me see, I found it, okay, which is where I was looking at the, here for example, how people's, for example, how if for example the people in New York, or the quotations in New York, say that economic arguments are more important in support of fracking, did that change over time? So when I'm looking at the data, these are like few quotations I gave you, and I want to look at, like, say for example, if people said that in bills from 2005, right? And if I look at the bills over the years, say up to 2018, and did it change over time? So when I said
change,
yes,
what I'm curious to know
yes.
is that when you are studying these changes, so have you done this on in vivo or separate from in vivo?
No, that is on in vivo. As we enter it, then we will, yes, on in vivo. Yeah.
Will that lead to different codes altogether? Different codes that highlight this temporal distribution?
It should, because yes, if we are doing it like over the years, then I will have to like add a few more dimensions to it, saying that, well, they started off saying that this is an economic argument, then over time in 2015, could be because of many reasons, maybe a new governor came in, or the Department of Environmental Protection in Pennsylvania changed, and now they have a whole new set of lawyers who have a whole different argument in 2018. So then I'll have to add more, I'll have to break it down on that slide. I'll have to break it down a little bit more, that it's not just a simple economic argument, then it is economic argument, maybe there are watershed moments when those economic arguments changed, or watershed moments when those environmental arguments change. So I'll have to break that down a little bit more as I have more data.
Right.
So,
right.
That,
so
yes.
I'm just, this
No,
is more
that's
out
a
of
good point.
curiosity. So have you undertaken that step, or is that
not
still?
yet, no, not
okay,
yet,
okay,
because
fine.
I'm still on like the interview, the data that I have analyzed so far is it starts from 1995. So far we are up to like 2002 or 3. So as I go along, and I'm quite sure that there will be changes in how people are viewing it as more info. For example, as more information becomes available about the water, when you turn on the tap, there's an explosion. So if there is more information in local communities, did that have an impact on? Was it used in the discussion about a bill, for example, or did some of the people I interviewed, did they mention it as a reason why they think fracking? Their views have changed. So as I go along, I'm hoping that once we have done the review, we will have to add new and break those things down into like years or maybe periods of time, or add like watershed moments, that these are the years where there seems to be a sudden shift in people's approach to fracking in
Right.
that particular state.
So thank you, Professor Damayanti, for such insightful presentation.
Thank
I had a
you.
couple of observations, and maybe you can reflect on it. So the way you have presented, it looks more like a top-down approach. So there is a state, there are say governance mechanism, and somehow they are controlling everything. I mean, the way it looks to me. But then I also understand that I don't know about what is happening in US, but I'm sure there might be many agencies, NGOs,
Yes.
who might be even filing cases
Yes.
against the state, against
Yeah.
the companies. Just to say, assert this point, that look, we are also here, and we can also make some change.
Absolutely.
And when you are looking at the temporal dimension, I was curious that over a period of time, with more awareness, can it happen that more people, they are putting more pressure on the government, and then make some tangible.
Yes, and there was actually in the case of New York, for example, their environmental groups were very active in fighting back against it. There was there was actually a division in New York between between citizens from downstate New York and upstate New York. Upstate New Yorkers, many of them wanted it because given that there is a socioeconomic situation. Downstate New York is New York City and the suburbs of New York City, who are not dependent on the land in upstate New York. They have other kinds of jobs. So they were more focused on arguing that, well, this is bad for the environment, and the people who live in upstate New York were very upset with them. So there was a bit of a division between upstate and downstate New York. They were fighting with each other as well. But there was a lot of pressure. One of the reasons why the ban happened, New York was actually giving permission. By 2010, they were giving drilling permits. And then there was a tremendous pushback from the communities there. The people started organizing. There's tremendous politicking going on in New York, in United States all the time on these issues. Even in Pennsylvania, there is a lot of pressure to, the argument is that if we are to go ahead with it, that's fine, but then can we think of more technology that will not make, protect our freshwater resources. So there is a pretty strong anti-fracking movement, or at least making fracking, changing the dynamics of fracking to make it, to push back on the state. So it's not just that the state does it and then everybody is like, okay, fine, this is the way to go. There is enormous pressure, and then the pressure sometimes in Pennsylvania, for example, it depends. I mean, right now there is a lot of pressure to add more regulations. Republicans don't want to do it. With the Ukraine war, actually, that demand is a little bit less because the energy independence argument has gained a lot of traction right now. So it ebbs and flows, but there is tremendous pressure and pushback against whatever the view that the state or the agencies are presenting. And of course, those views are also not, everybody does not have the same opinion about things, even within the agencies, right? So if you talk to, say, the Department of Environment Protection, officials, the top officials, they'll say one thing. You talk to the lawyers, they have a whole different perspective. So there is a lot of back and forth there. It's not all like.
So maybe it would be another interesting paper if you could capture this bottoms-up approach and then use another theoretical lens to see what is happening.
Yes, that is a good point. But most of my research has been, the reason why I was trying to focus on this is that most of my research has been before this on like how do communities mobilize and protest. So I thought it would be interesting to look at it from the other side and see how is it that environmental policies on fracking are made in these two states, rather than, and there are movements. So it would be interesting to look at that as well to see, well, how do they fight back? And what happens when, for example, there is a conflict between, say, the state agencies and the local or municipal agencies. That happens to even within the government structure. It's not like everybody agrees to everything. So, or two municipalities may be fighting over whether they should have fracking in like a border area. One doesn't want it, the other wants it. So that is also another dimension that might be interesting. But for this project, I was specifically only looking at how does the state agencies handle it. But yeah, that would be a very good way of looking at it, how people
and one more similar observation for the case of Sundarbans. So I understand that, okay, the government or maybe the state, they are trying to intervene at their own level. But then the people, the common people, they have their own narrative, and they also try to exert their agency. So for example, what they can themselves do. So I'm aware that in few countries, people have started to plant mangroves. We don't know whether it will succeed or not to stop the flooding or those kind of cases. But still, they are trying to showcase that we are trying to do something to mitigate the impact.
Yes.
So maybe in the case of Sundarbans also, it would be interesting to understand that how do people interpret their own future.
And what do they think, what should be
what should be done or what they are doing.
That they want. I would like to find that out.
Because rather than mere recipient,
so
we
just
can
saying
consider
that,
them as active agents.
Yes, and just saying that, okay, building resilient communities also generally comes from the community up, right? So how do they view resilience? What do they think is going to be most appropriate for their conditions? So certainly, yes. So, I mean, that's something I want to find, because this project is not going to be about the state government at all. It's entirely about the communities that live there. So this time I'm going to get to see what the communities, how do they view it, what are the challenges, how are they dealing with it, and what are some of the ways in which they think they should be able to adapt.
So do you have any further questions? Yeah.
Hello, ma'am. I am Anushka. I am from Public Policy and Management Group here. Thank you for this nice presentation. It's not a question, but just wanted to know your experience. Like as you mentioned that you had to talk to and interview many state agents, legislatures, or lawyers, like people from government. How did you, I wanted to know how did you approach them and what was their response to you? Because I have been facing this problem for my project. So basically I am doing an ethnography in a district court in Bihar. So I am facing a lot of problem, like when I want to talk to a judge or when I want to talk to any staff. So there are a lot of objections. I am trying to get permission from High Court, but there's a lot of bureaucracy there. So I just wanted to know your experience. How did you navigated that there in US? What happens there? Thank you.
It was, yeah, no, that's actually a good question, because especially when you're doing ethnographic work, it's one of, even if you work with communities, I mean, you have to find one person to get in, right? I mean, people just don't have, you can't just go and say, I want to do a 1 hour interview, and they're just going to sit there, not do their work, and just talk to you, right? No one wants that. No one wants to do that. But it's a little bit easier when you're working with communities, because if you have 1 or 2 people who are familiar with it, and then they introduce you to, like, it's called snowball sampling, I think you know. So they introduce you to like 5, and then that would lead to 10, and that's how you kind of get as many as you want. It's a bit harder with state officials, because there is a lot of ego there, right? And you can't, community members are much more open about things. These people are not. You want to record them, they'll be like, okay, I don't want to talk. So it was I found it a little bit challenging this time. I've done a lot of ethnography before, but mostly on the community side, so that seemed easier. What I did was, since I was talking to elected officials, it was impossible to get them to directly talk to me. They have like all these minders that you have to go through. So I knew someone who, at Cornell University, for example, in case of New York, and Pennsylvania, I went through that. Penn State and Cornell universities have these extension offices. They are academics who work with these officials, state officials. I went to them first and said, well, can you write me a letter? Can you just call someone to say I can? And even if it's like a minor staffer, that will be fine too. I can just make my way up through that channel. So I went to them, and they introduced me to, they wrote some letters for me for staffers, staffers who are like junior staffers. And then I went and met them, and they took forever. But I went and sat in their office for many hours, and then they introduced me to the more senior staffers. And then I just kept pushing until I could get the head guy to get me to the legislators. Start with like one of the younger staffers if you can. They might have more sympathy because they've been students maybe a few years ago, so they kind of see the pain in your eyes, and they might just open their heart and let you in. So that's how I did. I just kind of pushed them, complimented them, and just made them introduce me to other people. So it will need a little bit of pushing, and will take time, and it's very frustrating. But sometimes they would even if you are meeting with a legislator, sometimes they might say, I just want to do the interview over the phone. I don't have time to meet you. Or can you send me the questionnaire? I will just write the responses and fax it back to you. And sometimes I just said, okay, because at least I will have the interviews, right? So just try to be flexible and start with the lower stuff. They might take them out for coffee or something, and then just keep pushing until they allow you to get to do it, interview it. So that's the only solution I can say, but it will take time. I mean, I think it's a lot harder to work with these people than with communities. It's much easier with communities. So yeah.
Thank you. So thank you, Professor Damayanti, for sharing your insights. On behalf of CDEP, I would like to express my sincere gratitude that you took some time from your busy schedule and was able to deliver this talk. And would indeed look forward for further association with you. And maybe once your research in Sundarbans is over, it would be great that if you can please come and share our insight. Yeah. And maybe as a part of CDEP, we will be also involved in writing some reports and other stuff. So it would be great if you can please collaborate with the center. Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot.